Okay, so because I can't assume that you've read the Bhagavad Gita, although I would obviously challenge you to do so. There's good translations out there. Let's make sure we understand a little bit about what's going on. When you hit part 3 of Dry Salvages, and all of a sudden you read at line 126, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things. Or one way of putting the same thing. Whoa, wait, what are you talking about? Krishna meant? What is this? Are we talking about Jesus Christ? Well, no. Krishna is God in a human form in the Bhagavad Gita, coming down to have a conversation with Arjuna about why he should go out and fight. Now that's of course going to be a strange fact that Gandhi will be such a great pacifist and be against war, and yet the Bhagavad Gita is about fighting. But there's different kinds of fighting too. And much of our reading of the Gita is about a different kind of fighting than physical fighting. It's the fighting of soul or spirit, right? Here now we're going to be introduced to the centering movement, the Gita, the lines that are important that I quoted to you already. Now think about this one. If in Burnt Norton we have the poet and his relationship to the rose garden, and in East Coker we have the poet and his relationship to the sacramental rite, ceremonial rite of marriage, here we have the poet and his relationship to a sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita. Right? Now T.S. Eliot at Harvard did study Sanskrit and the Hebrew and the Hindu and Buddhist texts, and he said of the Gita that it's the next greatest philosophic poem to the Divine Comedy within my experience, end quote. So we should point out his appreciation of what's being said here is significant. Let's go through these lines now and work through them. He begins with the fallibilist position again. I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things, that we're all somehow connected, in other words. Or one way of putting, go back to East Coker, line 69, right? That was one way of putting it, not very satisfactory. One way of putting the same thing. What is it? What is the thing that's being said? That the future is a faded song, a royal rose. Notice the capitalization of both of those two words, right? And of course, roses we know are important. Or a lavender spray of wistful regret for those who are not yet here to regret. Pressed between, again, we're back to this notion of being between two wars, yellow leaves of a book that has never been opened. And the way up is the way down. Our Heraclitus quote from the very beginning, right, of Burnt Norton. The way forward is the way back. Then at line 132, the use of the word you. You cannot face it steadily, but this is sure. Now wait a minute. Here we are at the absolutist position epistemologically. What is he sure about? That time is no healer. Now that's ironic, of course, because two things. We're back to our wounded surgeon trying to heal us through our disease, right? And secondly, the cliche of all cliches is time is the great healer. And our speaker here is like, I'm not sure about that. It depends on what you mean by healing, and it depends on what you mean by time, right? The patient, we're back to East Coker, part 4 again. The patient is no longer here. In other words, we're constantly changing all the time because of who we are. And then he uses an interesting word picture, right? The train, right, at line 134. When the train starts and the passengers are settled to fruit, periodicals, business letters, of course, notice again your threes, right? And those who saw them off have left the platform. Their faces relax from grief into relief. What a beautiful line, right? In other words, maybe they're sad because they have to leave somebody, but then once finally the train is ready to leave, they kind of go, whew, okay, got that over and done with, into relief. To the sleepy rhythm of 100 hours. We've heard that notion before. And then for the first time, the language is used. Line 139, fare forward, travelers, not escaping from the past into different lives or into any future. You are not the same people who left that station or who will arrive at any terminus while the narrowing rails slide together behind you. Again, note this idea of you are not the same people. The idea of evolution, right? He says there's no escaping the fact that inevitably we are evolving. But evolution is understood as what, right? Well, notice the use of I love his verbs, right? the narrowing rails slide together behind you. A little bit later he'll talk about the boat and the water behind the boat and all of that. Only it's widening. And on the deck of the drumming liner, we're back to boats again, and of course Yeats and Sailing to Byzantium. Watching the furrow that widens behind you. Again, this is a wonderful word picture. You shall not think the past is finished, or the future is before us. At nightfall, in the rigging and the aerial, is a voice descanting, more wonderful verbs. Though not to the ear, the murmuring shell of time, that's a great metaphor, word picture, right? The shell of time. And not in any language, again, the translinguistic nature of this language. Fare forward, the second time that it gets used from the Bhagavad Gita. You who think you are voyaging. Now, again, we pointed this out from the very beginning, that all these poems are about journeys. Old men ought to be explorers. The Odyssey comes to mind, no question. All of our epic poems that tell of these journeys. I mean, think about it. Beowulf has to come to fight in the land of the Danes, but first he's got to get in a boat and sail, right? Okay, this idea that you got to go on a journey, right? You are not those who saw the harbor receding, or those who will disembark. You're not. Isn't it weird to say this? You're not you. You're not the same you that you were when you walked into room 303 at the very beginning. So you're changing, you're evolving, you're growing, you're aging, or you're dying. With every breath, there's a death, right? As he will say. Here, between, we're back again to this between stuff of line 130 and this between two wars. Here, between the hither and the farther shore, while time is withdrawn, consider the future and the past with an equal mind. Now, this notion of equal mind, equanimity, of course, in the contemplative traditions of both Christian and Buddhist contemplative traditions, always talk about this equal mind, equanimity, right? The calm mind. At the moment which is not of action or inaction. In other words, we're moving beyond action or inaction. You can receive this. On whatever sphere of being the mind of a man may be intent at the time of death, that is the one action. And the time of death is every moment, which shall fructify in the lives of others. And do not think of the fruit of action. Now, there's a whole lot going on here. I'll only be able to say just a little bit about what we're dealing with here. Notice, for example, that we will have this this idea that there's, at the moment of your death, whatever it is that you're thinking about, borrowing from the Tibetan Book of the Dead possibly even, that whatever it is that your mind is focusing on, that for you is all that will matter in your life. Of course, each time, he says, each time of death is every moment, right? In other words, we should always be thinking about the fact that there will come a moment when we're no longer here, right? What is it Longfellow says in Psalm of Life? Art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. And then the idea is lives of great men, Longfellow will say, all remind us we can make our lives sublime. This idea that we're all somehow involved in the lives of others. Your life leads to the lives of others. It's a compelling idea. But he says about all of this, don't worry about the fruit of action. Now, we've said this in other lectures, but let's pause because it's just a compelling idea. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. In other words, when you do a job, do the job for the job. Why? Because if you do a job expecting a reward, a compliment, let's say, for example, and it doesn't come, you will begin to doubt the value of the work that you've done. What a tragic place to be. Do the job for the job. And don't worry about the fruits. Now, you may get fruits, but that is not why you will do the job. Of course, the counter to this is you can't be lazy either and say, well, if the fruits don't matter, then it doesn't matter what I do. I'll just sit here and do absolutely nothing. And of course, Krishna speaking to Arjuna will say, no, not at all. And then finally a third time, fare forward. Not farewell, but fare forward. In other words, the idea is it's time to go forward. I've had students that when they leave their pals after they've studied this poem, they don't say farewell anymore. They don't say goodbye. They say fare forward. Old men ought to be explorers. We're always on a journey. It's a good way, I think, to remind ourselves of that your graduation day will be awesome, but you got to get up the next day, and you got to keep going. And there will come a moment in your life when you probably won't even remember hardly your graduation day. Why? Fare forward, right? Oh, voyagers. And again, this notion of we're all seekers, we're all voyagers. Oh, seamen, you who come to port, you whose bodies will suffer, we think of again, Gautama Buddha, life is dukkha, life is suffering, who suffer the trial and judgment of the sea or whatever event, this is your real destination. By the way, just point out that at line 168, we have a quotation mark that actually started at line 151. So all of this has been instructional information from Krishna to Arjuna. So Krishna, as when he admonished Arjuna, and we could point out, the 4 quartets, no question, T.S. Eliot wrote them as admonition. An admonition to a group of people who needed admonition given the time that the poems are being written and published. The bombs were dropping on London. These poems resonated powerfully with the readers of that day. I think they can still resonate today. I think they can challenge us at least, right? Admonished Arjuna on the field of battle. Again, given that we're World War II, that's a compelling line, right? Not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers, explorers, from East Coker, line 204, right? Fare forward used in 4 times. It's like a mantra. It's like the bell. It's like this gong that's going off, right? Okay, let's finish now quickly. I will give you a quote from Paul Kramer, the great scholar of this section especially. He says, T.S. Eliot creates an intra-religious dialogue between Christianity and Hindu or Buddhism. That's compelling. Karma yoga, to return now to the idea of the yogas that are taught in the Gita. Karma yoga is about renunciation of the fruits of action, as we were talking about. Bhakti yoga is surrender and selfless devotion, that is to say, love. And somehow these are all attached. Non-attached action is the idea that we were talking about with Fare Forward. At 2a, then, work with joy in your heart. Never worrying about the results. Don't worry about the grade in a class. Study for the learning, for your own growth. A compelling idea, right? The grade will come, maybe, maybe not. But what difference does that make in the end? Well, I've got to get the grade. What? What you need is the learning, for the growing, for the preparation, for the moments in your life when you will need it the most. At level 2b, of course, the symbols. Well, there's so many. I love that murmuring shell of time, right? You pick it up on the beach and you listen to it at line 150. Of course, at 3a, we've obviously got the Gita. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, I think, is a compelling one. That notion that your last thought when you're dying. I've said this before in lectures, right? When we did Plato's Phaedo, we said this with Socrates, that at the moment of death, everybody says the same words. The words are, oh my God. The only question is the inflection of the voice, right? For most of us, think of Scrooge. It's, oh my God, what have I done with my life? Crap, if I could have it back over. I wish I... Regrets, in other words. There are some people, and I think this is the illumination that is really being emphasized here by T.S. Eliot. There are some people, though, who come to the moment of their death, and they are prepared. They've lived the life they needed to live, and they're ready to go. Right? I think that's what Thoreau was really challenging us to say in Walden when he said that, right? We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. That notion of the conscious endeavor, where did he get an idea like that? Well, there were only a couple of books that Thoreau took with him to his cabin at Walden, and one of them was the Bhagavad Gita. The unity of ideas. It's quite compelling, isn't it? Right? Finally, at level 3b, well, how about this one? Do you agree or disagree with this philosophy? Right? I mean, think about this. As an athlete, for example, don't worry about winning the championship. The championship will come. You take care of enjoying the experience. And then if you don't win the championship, you still can look at the season as meaningful, as valuable, because you learned something important. It's an interesting idea. Well, all right, we turn now to the brief set of lines that is Dry Salvages Part 4. The Queen of Heaven is often the referencing here. Again, another lyrical prayer. This is lines 173 to 187 of 561 to 575 if you're doing the accumulating work here. Now again, just to remind you, like we've seen before, we've got a structure here in the four quartets of each poem where the fourth is this kind of lyrical poem, right? Remember we had the wounded surgeon before, the kingfisher's wing before. Now we're going to get to the Queen of Heaven. All right. Now you can Google this. There is a church called Our Lady of Good Voyage Church in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and you can Google this and you can see a picture of this where there is Mary as an icon who is standing there at in between and looking out towards the ocean and holding a ship. Google that and take a look at that. Let's go ahead now and listen to these lines briefly. Here we go. Dry Salvages, Part 4.
A lady whose shrine stands on the promontory, pray for all those who are in ships, those whose business has to do with fish, and those concerned with every lawful traffic, and those who conduct them. Repeat a prayer also on behalf of women who have seen their sons or husbands setting forth and not returning. Filia del tuo figlio, Queen of Heaven. Also pray for those who were in ships and ended their voyage on the sand, in the sea's lips, or in the dark throat which will not reject them, or wherever cannot reach them the sound of the sea bells, perpetual Angelus.
Okay, again, T.S. Eliot, just brilliant in his ability to say so much in just a few lines. By the way, speaking of lines, take a look again at structure. Notice we've got 3 stanzas, and each stanza is 5 lines long. Do you see this? And we'll take each one of them in order really quickly, right? Notice, we're going to move from Krishna to Mary. Of course, in Christian theology is so important because she was the mother of Jesus Christ, right? Now, as a child, Eliot saw this Our Lady of Good Voyage Church when he was a child visiting there. Notice he speaks right directly to it. Lady whose shrine stands on the promontory, pray for all those who are in ships. And again, this has been a poem about prayer, hasn't it, right? Whose business has to do with fish and those concerned with every lawful traffic, those who live their lives well, and those who conduct them. Praying, notice, is used in every one of the stanzas of this prayer. Repeat a prayer also on behalf of women. Again, we pointed out, women are mentioned more often in the Dry Salvages than in any of the other poems, who have seen their sons or husbands. We think about line 41, those anxious women, right? Setting forth and not returning, this idea that, sometimes those sailors went out, they did not come back. And then there's a line here in Italian that actually comes, in translation, it's daughter of thy son. It's from Dante. It's the last canto, actually, from the Divine Comedy of Paradiso, right? The idea is that Christ is the father of all people, so Mary is the daughter of thy son, okay? Queen of Heaven. This idea, some have pointed out, is a kind of bringing together then of the worship of Mary. But what makes Mary and Krishna so significant? Well, we're going to ask that question in a little bit. Of course, for both Mary as well as Krishna's advice to Arjuna, it's about self-surrender, isn't it, right? Also, to finish, pray for those who were in ships and ended their voyage on the sand, in the sea lips, beautiful, beautiful line, or in the dark throat, which will not reject them. We think about, again, Wasteland and Phlebas the Phoenician, A Fortnight Dead. We read those in our East Coker lines, right? Or wherever cannot reach them the sound of the sea bells, perpetual Angelus. The idea that the bells, the Angelus, the bells that call for the repetitions for the Hail Marys are there. Let's make some observations really quickly about the ways in which Gita's Krishna teaches. The Christian Mary embodies, and both of them emphasize this notion of surrender. At 2a, well, you might say that from our reading of this, we all need salvation, we all need help, we all need hope, we all need some kind of intercession of a kind. At 2b, our symbols, well, obviously Mary here is the symbol of this passage. And a symbol of what? Surrender, right? Surrender. At 3A, I like to think of Dickinson's Hope as the thing with feathers. You can go and take a look at that one. The idea that you got to have hope. You got to have hope to find a way to get through this life. Many of you pointed out to me after you studied Wasteland with me, that's a pretty hopeless poem. Some of you are already saying, these four quartets, these are more hope-filled poems. At least there's some sense that maybe there's a chance for us to not be totally hopeless. Finally, at 3B, since we're speaking of hope, what do you hope for? A 3B question. Is it important, do you think? Could someone live who was hopeless? Or rather, is hope a necessary requirement for living? Well, speaking of hope, let's go now to Dry Salvages Part 5. This is The Impossible Union is the title that we will give to it, lines 188 to 237, or if you're doing the cumulative line counting 576 to 625, okay? Now, in Burton Norton and in East Coker, in Part 5s, both were attempting to make some sense or to maybe bridge the gap between words and meaning. We're not going to have that here. We will have it again in Little Gidding, the last of the four poems. Here, however, we have, I think, something even more compelling. Let's listen to the reading, and then we'll come back to finish our comments. Really try and focus and see how well you can conquer monkey mind.
To communicate with Mars, converse with spirits, to report the behavior of the sea monster, describe the horoscope, haruspicate or scry, observe disease in signatures, evoke biography from the wrinkles of the palm and tragedy from fingers, release omens by sortilege or tea leaves, riddle the inevitable with playing cards, fiddle with pentagrams or barbituric acids, or dissect the recurrent image into preconscious terrors, to explore the womb or tomb or dreams. All these are usual pastimes and drugs and features of the press.